Decades after a tragedy buried him in quiet one man's past, rose from the wild to meet him again, alive, breathing, and waiting. What the cameras captured that day wasn't just a reunion, it was proof that some promises echo louder than time itself. Like this, if you believe in second chances, subscribe for more, and share where you're watching from in the comments. Under a pale dawn sky, the sanctuary breathed quietly, its tall grass glistening with dew as the sun climbed over the horizon. In that soft, forgiving light sat an elderly black man named Malcolm Trent, motionless in a wheelchair that had seen better years. His frame was thin, his hands dark and calloused, resting lightly over the metal rims of his chair, as if holding back a storm of emotion. The air around him felt different, still charged like the pause before an orchestra begins. The rangers who stood nearby didn't speak. They'd been told only that an old visitor was coming to see the animals. No one expected this. On the far end of the field, a German shepherd emerged from the mist. The dog's gait was slow measured, its fur streaked with silver, and its left ear slightly bent from some long-forgotten fight. Its eyes, sharp amber and intelligent, scanned the area before locking onto the man in the chair. For reasons no one could explain, the shepherd froze. Then it started walking not toward the handlers who fed it every day, but toward the stranger. The rangers stiffened instinctively, reaching for their tranquilizers, but something in the air stopped them. The dog's approach wasn't threatening. It was deliberate, almost hesitant, like a child remembering a dream. Malcolm's chest tightened. He blinked, unable to look away. Every sound faded: the birds, the wind, the murmurs of the staff, until all that existed was the space between him and the creature closing in. His lips trembled as he whispered, "No, it can't be." But it was. Step by step, the dog came closer, until it was only a few feet away. The rangers moved, but the old man lifted one hand. "Let him come," he said quietly, his deep voice steady. Despite the tremor in his fingers, the shepherd stopped, head tilted, studying the man's face as though searching the lines of age for something once familiar. A few seconds passed, heavy, eternal, and then, in a gesture no one could have predicted, the dog raised one paw and placed it gently on Malcolm's knee. The contact was light, almost reverent. The paw rested there as if to say, "I found you." The rangers gasped. One of them muttered, "That's impossible. He doesn't do that with anyone." Malcolm's throat constricted as tears welled in his eyes. "Hey there, boy," he whispered, his voice breaking into the open air. "You remember, don't you?" His words were soft, but they carried weight: years of loneliness, guilt, and the silent ache of something unfinished. The dog's tail moved, once then stilled. The moment hung fragile as glass. The sun broke fully over the horizon, and the light caught in Malcolm's tears, turning them into tiny golden beads. He lifted a trembling hand, hesitated, then brushed the coarse fur near the dog's ear. The shepherd leaned into the touch with a low sigh, closing its eyes for a moment, as if the years between them had never been. The younger ranger beside them whispered to the woman standing next to him, "He's never reacted like this, not once." She nodded slowly, eyes wide. "It's like he knows him." They didn't know that 30 years ago, on a cliff far from here, Malcolm Trent had given up his legs to save a pup that looked just like this one. They didn't know the sound of collapsing rocks still haunted him in dreams, or that he had prayed in the silence of his small house that the creature he rescued had lived a long, free life. And yet here, it was not a memory, not a ghost, but flesh and breath and heart. Malcolm looked at the dog again, his voice cracking like old wood. "You made it," he whispered. "You really made it." The shepherd tilted its head, the faintest sound rising from its throat, not a bark, not a growl, but something in between: a small, aching whine that only one man in the world could understand. It wasn't a coincidence, nor was it instinct. It was recognition, raw, pure, and wordless. The rangers around them felt something they couldn't explain, a mix of disbelief and reverence. None of them dared move closer. Malcolm reached down again, his palm resting against the dog's chest, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath his fingers. For a moment, he forgot the years, the surgeries, the endless hospital nights. All he felt was life, the same life he'd once pulled from the edge of death. The sanctuary workers were still standing in stunned silence, the air thick with something they couldn't quite name. The German Shepherd sat beside Malcolm's wheelchair as if he'd been there all his life, the quiet hum of morning broken only by the slow rhythm of their breathing. The younger ranger, still gripping the tranquilizer gun, whispered, "Sir, should we pull him back?" But his supervisor raised a hand, eyes wide and trembling. "No," she said, her voice cracking. "Let them be." None of them had ever seen anything like this. The dog was known for his calm demeanor, but never for affection. He kept his distance even from the ones who cared for him every day. He never barked, never nuzzled, and certainly never placed his paw on anyone. Yet now here he was, pressing close to a stranger in a wheelchair, head bowed, eyes glistening. No one had told the staff that the man sitting there was the reason this animal even existed. The records listed the dog only as a rescue found years ago by a retired ranger, no further details. The sanctuary had no idea that this visitor's name, Malcolm Trent, was carved into the story of that animal's first breath. And as the dog leaned against the wheel of the chair, a faint sound escaped him, half sigh, half whine, like something inside was remembering what language once felt like. Malcolm reached forward again, brushing the rough fur between the dog's ears. "You held on, didn't you?" he murmured. The ranger shifted uneasily, watching something both beautiful and frightening. There was an intensity in the dog's gaze, a fixed devotion that seemed impossible. He wasn't simply reacting, he was remembering. His movements were too deliberate, too specific, as if he were replaying a moment only he and this man knew. Every tilt of the head, every slow wag of the tail carried the weight of recognition. "Why does he do that?" one of the handlers whispered. "He doesn't do that for anyone." The supervisor didn't answer. She couldn't. The only thing she could feel was the deep, wordless current flowing between them. It was as if nature itself was bowing its head, acknowledging the quiet miracle in front of them. Malcolm's breath came slow and shallow, his voice barely above a whisper. "He knows me." The younger ranger blinked. "Sir, how could he?" Malcolm didn't respond. He was somewhere else now, lost in a fog of memory and disbelief. The dog pressed closer, resting its chin on his leg, and Malcolm felt the faint vibration of a low hum in the animal's throat, the same low growl he'd once heard from a terrified pup trapped under falling stone. It hit him like thunder, the way the dog had hesitated before stepping closer, the way it sat just to his left, and even the way it breathed. It was all the same. Every movement was a mirror of that day, the day the earth gave way beneath them. "He's doing it again," Malcolm whispered, tears forming behind his tired eyes. "He's doing it just like before." The rangers didn't understand, but the dog did. It shifted its weight, staring at Malcolm's face with an intensity that made even the air tremble. And then, for a fleeting instant, the old man felt something stir in his chest. A heartbeat from the past, a pulse he'd thought long buried. The sanctuary around him blurred into color and light, and all he could see was dust and falling rock, a young man's hands reaching a pup's terrified cry. His fingers twitched against the metal armrest as he blinked the vision away. "Easy, boy," he whispered again, though it wasn't to calm the dog, it was to steady himself. One of the rangers took a step forward. "Sir, are you sure you're okay?" Malcolm nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the shepherd. "You ever see something so impossible it makes you believe again?" The young man hesitated, unsure how to respond. Malcolm smiled faintly. "That's what this is." The dog blinked, shifting slightly, its tail brushing the grass. The wind blew through the field, and with it came the faint scent of soil and rain. The rangers could feel it too, the strange sacred rhythm between man and beast. It was more than a meeting. It was a return. "He's been waiting," the woman said softly. "All this time." Malcolm nodded, and I came back. For a while, no one spoke. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the field, and the dog leaned against the wheel of the chair once more. Every breath they shared seemed to pull them closer into a story the others could only watch from the outside. The Rangers didn't know that the connection they were witnessing had been written in blood and dust carved into the bones of both man and animal. They didn't know that 30 years ago, a man had traded his legs for a heartbeat that refused to die. But the dog knew. Somewhere in the deep recesses of his memory, in that primal place where scent and sound never fade, the dog carried the imprint of that moment. The smell of iron and sweat, the sound of rocks collapsing, the faint warmth of a hand that had chosen to save him. The next morning in the sanctuary felt like waking into memory. Malcolm sat quietly on the porch outside his small guest cabin, a cup of tea trembling between his hands, the air thick with the scent of wet grass and the distant calls of birds greeting the dawn. The German Shepherd lay near his feet, head resting on the earth, eyes half closed but alert in that way only old dogs could manage. For a long moment, Malcolm simply watched him, unable to believe how life had turned full circle, how this animal now beside him was the same helpless creature from decades before. The air around them felt like a held breath, as if the land itself remembered what they had endured together. He whispered almost to himself, "You were so small, I could hold you in one hand." The dog's ears twitched, lifting slightly as if the words touched something buried deep inside. That simple reaction opened the door to the past, and before Malcolm could stop himself, he was there again, 30 years younger, standing beneath a brutal Alabama sun. His ranger's badge glinting on his chest, sweat, tracing paths down his neck as he patrolled the edge of a desolate stretch of forest known for poachers. Back then, he was a quiet man who believed the wilderness spoke in its own language. If you stood still long enough, you could hear it breathe. He listened to the rustle of the trees, the low hum of cicadas, the faint crackle of heat rising off stone. That morning, something different whispered through it. A broken sound, a whine fractured by pain. He stopped scanning the tree line. There were no human voices, no movement, just that sound again, weaker this time. He followed it, boots crunching against dry leaves until the forest opened into a clearing scarred by gunfire. The earth smelled of blood and smoke. He saw the trap first, an iron snare clamped around a dog's leg. She was large tan and black, her fur streaked with dust and fear. She was a shepherd, maybe used for hunting, maybe abandoned. She had fought until exhaustion chained her still. Her breaths came sharp and shallow, but her eyes were clear, defiant. Malcolm knelt beside her, murmuring softly, "Easy, girl, easy." He knew that tone mattered more than words. Slowly, carefully, he opened his pack, pulling out a cloth and a small knife. The air was thick with flies, the heat unbearable, but he worked gently, cutting through the wire that had chewed into her flesh. The metal finally gave way with a sharp clang, and the sound echoed through the clearing. The shepherd whimpered, collapsing, but her eyes flicked toward the bushes nearby. Malcolm followed her gaze and froze. There, hidden beneath a tangle of weeds, was movement, faint, fragile. A pup barely old enough to stand trembling with hunger and fear. Its fur was the same gold-black blend as its mother's, its chest heaving as it tried to crawl closer. Malcolm's throat tightened. "You've been fighting for him," he whispered. The mother's tail gave one weak thump before falling still. She'd spent her last strength protecting her pup. Malcolm's pulse thundered as he realized she wasn't going to make it. He lifted the pup, cradling it against his chest, its heartbeat fluttering like a tiny drum against his uniform. "You're okay now," he murmured, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He stayed there for hours, sitting beside the mother dog, as her breathing slowed, his free hand resting gently on her flank. When the last breath left her body, the forest went quiet. Malcolm closed his eyes, bowing his head. He had seen death before. Poachers' predators, the cruel rhythm of survival, but this felt different. This was sacrifice. He buried the mother near the clearing, marking the spot with a small pile of stones, then wrapped the pup in his jacket and began the long walk back to his jeep. The sun beat down mercilessly, but he didn't stop. Every few steps the pup whimpered softly, as if calling for the mother that would never answer. "I know, kid," Malcolm said, voice raw. "I know." When he reached the outpost, the other rangers stared. "What's that?" one of them asked. "A new recruit," Malcolm replied, forcing a smile. But that night, after feeding the pup and cleaning its wounds, he sat alone by the window staring out at the stars. He named him King because even as a trembling pup, there was something regal in the way he looked at the world. Over the next weeks, the bond between them grew quickly. King followed him everywhere, patrols, paperwork, even meals. The other rangers joked that the dog was his shadow, but Malcolm didn't mind. He had spent most of his life listening to silence, and now for the first time, that silence had company. But the forest had a cruel memory. One afternoon, while tracking a group of suspected poachers, Malcolm took King along the ridge where the canyon split the land like a scar. The air was dry, the rocks unstable. The trail ended at a narrow cliff, and he heard the faint sound of movement below. "Stay here," he told King, but the dog barked, refusing to stay back. Malcolm knelt to steady himself, leaning over the edge, scanning the ravine below, and that was when the ground shifted beneath his weight. The stone cracked with a sickening snap, and in the chaos that followed, he saw the pup's eyes widen, heard the whine of panic, and felt the earth disappear. The sound of crumbling stone and rushing air was the last thing Malcolm Trent remembered before the world vanished beneath him. 1 second, he was leaning over the canyon's edge, reaching for a broken trail of footprints, and the next, he was falling weightless, helpless, a scream trapped in his chest. The sunlight spun into streaks above him, and for an instant, he saw the pup Little King teetering on the cliff's edge, eyes wide with fear. Instinct overrode pain, overrode gravity. As the ground gave way, Malcolm used the last fragment of stable earth beneath him to hurl the pup upward with all his strength. He didn't think. He just moved. His voice tore through the canyon. "Go!" The tiny body soared out of sight, vanishing over the lip of the cliff. And then came the impact, brutal, final. Pain exploded through his body like fire racing through dry timber. The air was knocked from his lungs and everything went white. Rocks rained down, burying him half in dust, half in silence. For what felt like hours, Malcolm drifted between consciousness and oblivion, his world reduced to the taste of blood, the stench of iron, and the weight crushing his legs. When the sound of his own heartbeat faded, another sound replaced it, faint, broken, and desperate. A whimper. The pup's cry. Somehow, impossibly, the little creature had crawled down the cliff halfway trying to reach him. "No," Malcolm rasped, voice hoarse. "Stay back." But the pup didn't stop. It barked again, softer this time, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like a promise. A laugh, dry and strangled, escaped him. Stubborn, just like me. The sun slipped lower, the heat baking the earth into clay. Flies gathered, the rocks pressed deeper into his flesh. His legs were twisted beneath him, bent at unnatural angles. He tried to move, but the pain was immediate and blinding. He felt the warm pulse of blood soaking through his uniform, the sharp edge of bone under skin. The ranger radio was shattered. His canteen cracked open beside him, leaking its last drops into the dirt. He had no way out. The only thing alive around him was the tiny shadow pacing above, refusing to leave. "You gotta go," he whispered again. "You can't stay here." But the pup barked once more, louder this time, defying him. The sound stirred something deep in his chest, not despair, but fierce, unyielding will. "Fine," he whispered. "Then we wait together." He lay there, eyes closed, listening to the rhythmic whine of the wind through the canyon. Somewhere in that rhythm, time lost meaning. He thought of his mother's porch, of the way she used to hum gospel tunes when she cooked. He thought of the wide open plains of Alabama, where he'd learned to track deer as a boy. He thought of the choices that led him here, the life he'd lived, protecting things that couldn't protect themselves. He'd always said it was worth it, even when it meant loneliness. But now, lying broken in the dirt, he wondered if anyone would ever know the story behind this fall. Maybe that didn't matter. Maybe saving one life, even a small one, was enough. The light dimmed. He was slipping. His breaths grew shallow. The pup's cries grew weaker, a fading heartbeat echoing his own. Just as the shadows swallowed him, he heard distant shouts, men's voices, boots crunching gravel. "Over here, we found him." It was his patrol team. He tried to speak, but could only manage a ragged groan. The sound must have reached them, because moments later, strong hands were digging through the rubble. Someone shouted, "He's alive, careful, with his legs." The rush of motion blurred around him, faces ropes, the smell of antiseptic from a first aid kit. Through it all, he could still hear the faint bark from above. The dog, he gasped, barely conscious. "Get the dog!" A young ranger climbed up the slope and moments later returned, carrying the pup in his jacket. "He's fine," the ranger said softly. "A few scratches, but he's fine." Malcolm let the words sink into him like rain into dry soil. His eyes fluttered shut, a small, contented smile ghosting his lips. "Good. That's good." Then everything went dark again. When he woke, it was to the smell of disinfectant and the low hum of hospital machines. Pain throbbed in his legs, distant yet constant, a reminder that his body had been rebuilt but not restored. The doctor's face came into focus. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "Your legs, they're badly damaged. You won't be walking again." The words didn't land like a tragedy. They landed like a fact, one more unchangeable truth of the wilderness. He nodded, staring past her at the window, where morning light spilled through the blinds. "What about the pup?" The doctor smiled faintly. "He's at the ranger station. They said he hasn't eaten. Keep sitting by the door." Malcolm turned his head away, eyes filling with quiet tears. "He's waiting," he whispered. "He doesn't understand." For months afterward, Malcolm learned the rhythm of stillness. He spent long hours in rehab, his body refusing to obey commands it once knew by heart. The Pup King was placed temporarily in a local shelter until Malcolm could take him home. The first months after the accident blurred together like an endless dream that refused to end. Malcolm Trent spent them in the hospital, then in rehabilitation surrounded by white walls, antiseptic air, and the sound of wheels echoing against tile floors. The doctors had done what they could, rebuilding what remained of his legs with metal pins and rods, but they couldn't restore the nerves that had been crushed beyond repair. They called it a miracle that he survived at all. He didn't see it that way. Each day he watched the sunlight crawl across the same window, marking time in a life that no longer belonged to him. When the Ranger Service sent a letter, thanking him for his years of duty and confirming his early retirement, he folded it once and placed it in a drawer. He didn't open it again. The men from his patrol visited once, awkward in their uniforms, their words clumsy with sympathy. They asked what had happened, how the cliff had given way. But Malcolm only smiled faintly and said, "The land decides when it's done with you." He never mentioned the pup. He never told them that he'd thrown his future upward to save a life too small to matter to anyone else. That secret belonged to him and to the wilderness that had taken everything in return. When he was finally released, he went home to a modest house on the edge of town. His sister helped him settle in, bought him a wheelchair, filled his pantry, and tried to smile as though everything could be fine again. But the silence between them grew. She asked once, "What really happened out there?" He looked away, tracing a hand over the scar that ran from his thigh to his knee. "I just slipped," he said, and that was the end of it. The truth felt too sacred to waste on pity. The following week, he asked the local shelter if they still had the pup that had been found near the canyon. They did. The staff remembered how the little German shepherd had refused to eat, sitting by the gate for hours as if waiting for someone. When Malcolm arrived, the dog recognized him instantly. The tiny creature scrambled into his lap, whining and licking his hands, and for the first time in weeks, he laughed. It was a thin, fragile sound, but it carried through the empty halls like sunlight through glass. He named him King not for the pup's strength, but for his will to live. Over the next months, they built a rhythm together. Malcolm learned to move with wheels instead of feet, and King learned to match his pace. They went everywhere together: the market, the post office, even to the edge of town where the woods began again. When strangers stared, the dog would position himself between them as if guarding not just his master's body, but the dignity that the world had tried to take from him. Malcolm didn't speak of the canyon, not once, not even to King, but he kept one reminder, a sliver of rusted metal, the corner of the snare he had cut free from the pup's mother the day he found them. He wore it on a thin cord around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, a piece of history no one else would ever see. Each night before bed, he'd run his thumb over its jagged edge, feeling the weight of everything it represented: pain, mercy, and the impossible beauty of survival. King grew fast, his paws too big for his body, his bark deepening with each passing season. The bond between them became something wordless, a conversation carried in glances and gestures. When Malcolm wheeled across the porch to watch the sunset, King would rest his chin on the man's leg tail, sweeping the floor. They didn't need words. They were two halves of a single promise kept long ago. But as years passed, the world changed around them. The ranger station sent invitations to ceremonies, awards, community events, gestures meant to honor his bravery. Malcolm always declined. He couldn't sit through speeches about heroism from people who didn't know what real sacrifice cost. Heroism wasn't medals or applause. It was choosing to save something you could lose everything for. And he had. One afternoon, while repairing the old screen door that hung crooked on its hinges, a neighbor's child wandered up wide-eyed and curious. "Mister, why can't you walk?" Malcolm looked at him for a moment, then smiled. "Because I saved somebody who could." The child didn't understand, but he nodded anyway, satisfied with the mystery. King barked once, as if laughing. In the evenings, Malcolm liked to sit on the porch, watching the dog chase fireflies through the fading light. Sometimes, when the air cooled and the sky deepened into violet, he would think about the mother dog buried under the stones, about the promise he made without words to keep her pup alive, to live long enough for both of them. The weight of that vow shaped every breath he took. He began keeping journals, not of his pain, but of gratitude, notes about the way King rested his head when storms came, the way his eyes followed every motion, patient, loyal, unflinching. He wrote about how mercy often costs more than cruelty, how kindness is a wound you learn to live with. He never published those words. They filled notebooks that sat quietly on a shelf, waiting for someone who might one day understand. The years turned the sharp pain in his legs into a dull ache, a permanent reminder that the past never truly leaves. But whenever he looked at King alive and strong, he knew the exchange had been fair. The years that followed moved quietly slow, as honey pouring from a jar, and Malcolm Trent learned to measure his days by the rise of the sun and the sound of paws padding across his small living room floor. King, now grown and broad-shouldered, was the steady heartbeat of the house. He slept near the bed, followed the wheelchair wherever it rolled, and never once strayed far. The two had built their own world, simple, silent, and self-contained, far from the noise of people who spoke about courage, but had never faced the wilderness that takes without warning. Every morning, Malcolm wheeled himself to the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the light spill through the pine trees at the edge of the yard. He'd speak to King softly about the weather or the dreams he'd had, not because he expected answers, but because the dog listened better than anyone he'd ever met. He'd say, "We're lucky, boy. Some folks spend their lives looking for purpose. We found ours when the ground gave way." The dog would tilt his head, brown eyes deep and knowing tail brushing the floor like a soft metronome of understanding. Time gave their companionship a rhythm. The seasons passed with quiet repetition. Spring rain soaking the earth, summer light flooding the porch, autumn leaves scattering across the yard. The world beyond his little home changed, but Malcolm's didn't need to. His body aged faster than his spirit. His hands grew rough, his beard silvered, but his eyes still held the same alertness that once searched the plains for movement in tall grass. Yet every so often, when the night stretched long and wind rattled the windows, he would wake in a cold sweat, his heart pounding with the echo of rocks breaking and a voice his own shouting into the void. Sometimes in that haze between dream and memory, he'd see King not as he was, but as something larger, older, almost mythic. The same dog standing in the doorway, head-high fur glinting with moonlight, watching over him like a sentinel from another world. He would blink, reach out, and the vision would fade. "You still watching me, huh?" he'd whisper to the empty doorway before rolling back to bed. One night, after a particularly vivid dream in which he saw the canyon again, only this time he didn't fall. He woke to the faint sound of scratching at the door. He turned the light on and froze. King was asleep at the foot of the bed, breathing slow and deep. But there, just beyond the threshold of the front door, were muddy paw prints, fresh ones leading up the steps and stopping right at the welcome mat. Malcolm stared for a long time, a strange calm washing over him. "Guess you came to check in," he murmured to the night, unsure whether he was speaking to memory, to the spirit of the mother dog buried long ago, or to the echoes of his own conscience that never truly rested. In the morning, the prince had dried and vanished in the sun, but he carried the image with him. He never mentioned it to anyone. It wasn't something to explain. It was something to feel. By his late 50s, the house had grown smaller around him, filled with the quiet clutter of a life lived inwardly, books on wildlife, faded photographs of his younger self in ranger uniform, an old map of the reserve hanging crooked on the wall, and King's leash rarely used but never put away. He didn't go far from home anymore. His sister had moved away. His friends retired, and the ranger service that once defined him was just a headline on the local news. Yet there was peace in that solitude. He didn't need recognition. His reward slept beside him every night. On afternoons when the pain in his legs became unbearable, he'd let King rest his chin across his lap, the dog's warmth easing the ache better than any medicine. "You were born to stay," Malcolm would say, smiling through the strain. He sometimes thought about the years they'd stolen from fate, the moment that should have ended them both, and how every breath since had been a kind of borrowed grace. He wondered if the mother dog, wherever she was, had seen what her pup became. If she had known that the human who cut her free from the trap would one day sit broken, but content sharing the same quiet loyalty she had once shown her child. The thought comforted him. But time, like the forest, always demands its balance. One gray morning, he noticed King limping slightly as he walked across the yard. It was subtle at first, just a favoring of one leg, but over the next months, it worsened. The vet said it was arthritis common in older dogs, nothing unexpected. But for Malcolm, it felt like watching a reflection fade. He began to wake earlier, taking more care with their routine, making sure King's food was softened, his steps slower, his rest longer. "We're getting old together, partner," he'd say. "Guess that's fair." King still followed him from room to room, still laid by the wheelchair, but his energy dulled into a quiet stillness that mirrored his owner's. They had grown into each other, one strong where the other was weak, one walking where the other rolled, both bound by something that time couldn't explain. When storms rolled through, Malcolm would wheel himself to the porch, and King would lie beside him, both of them staring out at the rain as if it were a film of their shared life playing across the sky. He'd tell the dog stories from the old days about nights patrolling the savannah, about the way the stars used to look when he still walked among them. "You wouldn't believe how loud the world used to be," he'd say, chuckling softly. "Guess we both learned how to listen instead." The older he got, the more the quiet suited him. He didn't resent the chair anymore. It was just another tool like his old rifle had been. The wilderness had stripped him of his legs, but in return, it had given him an understanding most people never reach, that to save something pure, sometimes you have to surrender part of yourself. As dusk settled one evening, he rolled into the yard to find King standing by the old oak at the fence line, the same spot the dog had always loved. The wind was soft, carrying the smell of rain, and for a moment, Malcolm thought he saw something in the dog's eyes that felt ancient recognition mixed with farewell. "You dreaming again, boy." Dreaming? The morning that changed everything began like any other, quiet and ordinary, with sunlight crawling through the blinds and the slow, steady rhythm of the German shepherd's breathing filling the little house. Malcolm Trent sat at the kitchen table, spoon stirring his coffee, absently lost in the pattern of swirling steam. King was asleep beside his chair, muzzle resting against the wheel, the familiar low sigh of an aging dog who had lived too much and asked for nothing. The years had mellowed both of them, worn them smooth in the same way the river shapes its stones. Then the phone rang sharp and unexpected, slicing through the calm. Malcolm frowned, glancing at the old landline on the wall. Hardly anyone called anymore. He wheeled himself closer, lifted the receiver, and said, "Trent Residence." The voice on the other end hesitated before speaking. Malcolm. The sound was distant, older, but recognizable. It was Reuben Davis, his former colleague from the Ranger Corps. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Reuben's voice softened. "Been a long time, brother." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Too long. I figured you'd forgotten about me." "Never could," Reuben replied. Then his tone shifted, uncertain. "Listen, I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't something strange." Malcolm's hand tightened on the receiver. "What is it?" There was a pause, the kind of silence that only carried heavy news. "You remember that pup, the one from the canyon?" The question struck like a thunderclap. Malcolm's throat went dry. "What about him?" Reuben exhaled. "He's alive, Mal. He's here." Malcolm's heartbeat stuttered. He looked down at King asleep by his wheel. "What are you talking about?" "Not that one," Reuben said quickly, as though reading his thoughts. "The original pup, the one you threw up that cliff. We found him years back, injured near the ridge, brought him to the sanctuary. We never knew where he came from. He's been there ever since." Malcolm's breath caught. "That's impossible. I thought so too. But listen, there's more. He's different. Never been aggressive, never barked without reason, but here's the thing, every time someone moves his cage door or works near him with tools, the moment he hears metal clink, he freezes. He sits perfectly still, stares out like he's listening to something we can't hear. We thought maybe he'd been trained that way, but it's too specific. And the strangest part, he doesn't bond with anyone. He'll eat, he'll rest, but he keeps his distance like he's waiting for something." Malcolm's hand trembled. The sound of Reuben's voice faded beneath the roar of memory. The crunch of metal, the squeal of his chair chain, the weight of the canyon pressing against his chest. The clink. That sound had followed him every day of his life. Every time his wheelchair shifted, the chain linking his footrest clicked softly against the frame, a rhythm that had become the heartbeat of his existence. He looked down now, hearing it as he moved slightly. Clink, clink. His pulse quickened. The sound was the same metallic echo the dog had learned 30 years ago, the sound that must have filled the canyon as he fell. "You still there?" Mal Reuben's voice pulled him back. "Yeah," he managed. "Yeah, I'm here. We've been calling him," Bishop Reuben continued, "but he's not like the others. You need to see it for yourself." Malcolm looked toward the window. Outside, the light had turned to gold, casting shadows across the porch, where so many mornings had passed in quiet peace. He could hear King stir beside him, nails tapping lightly against the floor. "You want me to come there?" he asked, slowly. "I think you should," Reuben said. "I think he's been waiting for you." Malcolm's mouth went dry. He swallowed hard, his voice a whisper. "I can't promise anything. You don't have to," Reuben replied. Just come see him." The line went dead. Malcolm sat there for a long time, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the ghost of Reuben's voice fade into static. He placed the receiver down and turned to King, who was now awake, watching him with curious, patient eyes. "You hear that, old boy?" Malcolm said softly. "There's another one out there, one that remembers." The dog tilted his head as if he understood. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Malcolm went through the motions of routine feeding, King reading his worn field journals, watering the plants, but his thoughts were elsewhere, circling back to the canyon, to that impossible sound of metal on rock, and to a life he'd long buried. When night came, sleep refused him. He dreamed of falling again, but this time he didn't hit the ground. He dreamed of two dogs, one gray, one gold, standing at the edge of the cliff, staring down into the dark, waiting for him to climb back up. In the dream, he reached out, and both of them disappeared into the light. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, the sound of the chain echoing faintly in the still air. For the first time in years, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, he packed a small bag, some clothes, a photograph of King as a pup, and the sliver of metal from the old snare he still wore around his neck. He called a local transport service and asked for assistance traveling to the sanctuary. The young driver who arrived looked surprised when Malcolm rolled out onto the porch, King by his side. "You sure about this, sir?" the driver asked. Malcolm smiled faintly. "Son, I've been sure for 30 years." The road stretched long and empty as they drove, the hum of tires blending with the soft breathing of the dog resting at his feet. He watched the landscape shift, pines giving way to open grasslands, the horizon widening with every mile. He thought of the years lost, the silence that had filled them, and how all of it led to this one strange, impossible call. As they approached the sanctuary gates, something inside him stirred, not fear, not excitement, but a sense of coming full circle. King lifted his head and gazing out the window, tail wagging once. "Almost there," Malcolm said quietly. "Almost home." When the vehicle stopped, he could see the same wooden sign he remembered from the days before his accident. The journey back to the sanctuary unfolded like a slow return to a forgotten dream, every mile carrying Malcolm Trent deeper into the landscape of his past. The morning sun climbed steadily as the van rolled down the narrow dirt roads, the hum of the tires blending with the clinking rhythm of his wheelchair chain. That faint metallic sound had always been part of him, a quiet reminder of the day the canyon had taken his legs but left him a purpose. King rested on the floor beside him, head between his paws, eyes watching the horizon through the open window. The scent of the earth changed as they traveled farther from town. The air thickened with pine, the dust grew redder, and somewhere within that mixture of wind and soil, Malcolm could almost smell memory itself. He hadn't seen this country in 30 years, but it hadn't let him go. Every curve of the road, every stretch of field stirred something half buried inside him, a pulse that refused to fade. He thought about Reuben's call, about the word alive, and how it had reignited something fragile and dangerous hope. He hadn't believed in miracles for a long time, but maybe this wasn't about belief. Maybe it was about mercy, finding its way back one paw print at a time. The driver, a young man named Caleb, glanced at him occasionally in the rearview mirror. "You worked out here before," Malcolm smiled faintly. "Long before you were born, son." Caleb nodded, curiosity flickering in his eyes, but he didn't ask more. The silence between them was easy, comfortable. Outside, the fields widened into golden plains, broken by patches of scrub and thorn. Birds wheeled in the distance, their calls thin but familiar. When they reached the old ranger checkpoint, Malcolm asked him to stop. The building was still there, smaller now, weathered, and nearly swallowed by weeds. The paint had peeled away the windows, clouded with dust. He asked Caleb to wheel him closer. The air smelled of rust and rain. He ran his hand along the faded wall and whispered, "You're still standing." King sniffed around the steps, tail swaying slowly, as if recognizing faint traces of the past. Malcolm could almost hear his younger self shouting orders, hear the laughter of his old team echoing off the hills. He could see the shape of the acacia tree that once stood behind the building, towering above everything else, its branches bent like an old sentinel watching over the land. But when he turned toward the field, the tree was gone. In its place stood something that made his breath hitch, a single memorial stone, tall and clean, with a plaque that caught the sunlight. Caleb leaned down, brushing the dirt away. The words were simple, in honor of Ranger Malcolm Trent, for service beyond measure. Below it, engraved in faint lettering, was his old badge number. For a long time, he couldn't speak. His hand trembled as he reached out to trace the letters. He had never wanted memorials, never asked for them. He'd always thought the forest itself would remember him better than any stone. But seeing it there, carved into permanence, stirred something deep in him. Not pride, not sorrow, but a quiet understanding that the world had not forgotten after all. "Guess you made your mark," Caleb said softly. Malcolm's voice was hoarse. "No," he murmured, "we made it." He looked down at King, whose gaze was fixed on the plaque tail resting still. "She's watching." Malcolm added, his voice catching, and though Caleb didn't know who he meant, he nodded anyway. The driver helped him back into the van, and the two of them drove the remaining miles in silence. The closer they got to the sanctuary, the heavier the air felt, dense with the scent of grass and memory. Fences appeared tall and silver under the sun, stretching endlessly into the distance. The land was vast, wild, yet restrained, echoing the same paradox that had always defined Malcolm's life: freedom bound by responsibility. When the vehicle stopped at the entrance gate, Reuben was there, waiting, older now, but unmistakable, his ranger uniform faded, but still neat. His face broke into a wide grin as he walked toward the van. "Malcolm Trent," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. "I'll be damned you really came." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Took me long enough." Reuben leaned down to shake his hand. "You look good, old man. You need better glasses," Malcolm replied, and they both laughed, a sound that loosened the years between them. Reuben's eyes softened when he noticed King. "Still keeping you out of trouble, other way around," Malcolm said. The two men stood there for a moment, letting the silence speak for all that didn't need saying. Finally, Reuben gestured toward the open field. "He's out there, Mal, the one you saved. We kept him in the outer enclosure. He doesn't like the pens. Too restless." Malcolm nodded, his pulse steady but heavy. "You think he'll remember?" Reuben hesitated, then said quietly, "Sometimes remembering isn't the hard part. It's forgiving what time did to both of you." That struck deep. Malcolm looked towards the horizon, where the fields shimmered under the sun, the faint outline of acacia trees in the distance, like ghosts of the ones he'd once known. "Let's find out," he said finally. Reuben helped wheel him down the dirt path, Caleb following with King trotting beside them. The air was warm, filled with the hum of insects and the distant rustle of wind through tall grass. Malcolm could feel the vibration of the earth beneath the wheels, each bump a heartbeat, pulling him closer to something he wasn't sure he was ready for. When they reached the main enclosure, Reuben stopped and pointed. "He's there," he whispered. Malcolm looked up and saw him. The German shepherd they called Bishop stood at the far edge of the field, his coat golden with streaks of gray, his build powerful yet lean. He was older but magnificent, a living echo of the pup Malcolm had once held in trembling hands. For a long time, the man in the chair and the animal across the field simply stared at one another. Then Bishop tilted his head, ears pricking at the faint metallic sound of the wheelchair chain moving in the wind. Malcolm froze. The dog's body stiffened, recognition flashing like lightning in his amber eyes. The air grew still. Then slowly Bishop began to walk forward. Reuben exhaled shakily. "He's coming to you." Malcolm's throat tightened. "He hears it," he whispered. He remembers the sound. King, sensing the moment, sat quietly at Malcolm's side, eyes on the approaching figure. The older dog's movements were steady, purposeful, each step bridging the years of silence that had separated them. As Bishop drew near, the smell of the wild reached Malcolm's senses, duskgrass, sun-warmed fur. It was the smell of life returning. For the first time in decades, the weight that had lived in his chest began to lift. For a long moment that stretched into eternity, neither man nor animal moved. The field between them felt like a sacred place where time itself held its breath. Bishop stood tall at the edge of the enclosure, his golden coat shimmering under the sun, the faint scars along his flank glowing like old constellations etched into living flesh. Malcolm Trent sat perfectly still in his wheelchair, his fingers gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Reuben and the young ranger stood a few yards back, unsure whether to intervene or to simply bear witness to what they both sensed was a meeting years in the making. The faint metallic click of Malcolm's wheelchair chain carried through the air again, and Bishop's ears twitched instantly. His head-tilted eyes narrowing with a focus that seemed to pierce through the fog of decades. Then, with one deep breath, the dog began to move. He didn't rush, didn't bound or bark. He walked slowly, each step careful and deliberate, as if tracing an invisible path he had walked before in another life. The earth vibrated faintly beneath his paws. King, sitting quietly beside the wheelchair, rose to his feet, but made no sound. His tail wagged once, then stilled, as if even he knew this moment wasn't his to interrupt. Bishop drew closer, his gaze locked on Malcolm's face. The old ranger whispered, "That's it, boy. You remember." His throat tightened, tears threatening to break the dam he'd held shut for years. When Bishop reached the final few feet between them, he stopped. His chest rose and fell, and his mouth opened slightly, not in a growl or bark, but in a soft, trembling whine that hit the air like the echo of a memory buried deep in stone. Malcolm froze. It was the same cry, the same helpless sound he'd heard 30 years ago in the canyon when he reached out his hand toward the trapped pup. The sound cracked the silence wide open. The old man's breath hitched as he whispered, "Oh God, it's you," Bishop whimpered again, then took another step forward, lowering his head, and before anyone could react, he did something no one had expected. The great dog pressed his nose against the metal of Malcolm's wheelchair, sniffing the frame, then brushed his muzzle gently against the man's knee, exactly as he had done before in the field that morning when they first met. Malcolm reached down with a trembling hand, his fingertips grazing the dog's fur, rough but warm. The contact sent a shock of recognition through him so pure that he felt his heart skip. "You came back," he said, voice breaking. The dog licked his wrist once, then looked up, eyes wet and bright. Reuben whispered to no one in particular, "He knows him. Dear Lord, he really knows him." Tears slipped down Malcolm's cheeks as he stroked the dog's head, his palm trembling as though afraid the creature might vanish if he blinked. "I thought I lost you," he said softly. "I thought that day ended both of us." Bishop leaned closer, resting his head against the old man's leg tail, moving in small, slow arcs. The chain on the wheelchair clicked again, and Bishop's ears twitched at the sound, his gaze never leaving Malcolm's face. "You followed the sound," Malcolm murmured. "All these years you remembered the one thing that kept us both alive." He turned to Reuben, voice thick with awe. He didn't forget. Reuben wiped a sleeve across his eyes. "Looks like neither did you." Then Malcolm noticed something glinting in the sunlight. Around Bishop's neck hung a worn leather collar, and attached to it was a small piece of metal, shaped irregularly dull at the edges, but unmistakable. He leaned closer. His breath caught. It was the same fragment of rusted snare he had once kept after freeing Bishop's mother, the same one he'd worn for years on a cord around his neck before losing it during his move to the city long ago. But this one was polished, restored, cleaned of its blood and rust. "Where'd he get that?" Malcolm whispered. Reuben frowned. "We found him wearing it the day he was rescued. We thought it was just a tag someone added later. No one knew what it meant. Malcolm let out a shaky laugh that turned into a sob. It meant he found me again. The revelation was too much too perfect, too impossible to be coincidence. Somewhere in the mystery of years, the wilderness had taken what was broken and returned it whole. Bishop shifted slightly, his nose bumping against the man's hand, urging him to keep petting, grounding him in the moment that neither memory nor reason could fully hold. King stepped forward, then sniffing Bishop cautiously, tails brushing in a silent greeting between two guardians of the same man. There was no tension, only quiet understanding. It was as if King recognized the other dog's importance, yielding space the way one soldier yields to another of higher rank. The Rangers stood in silence, their faces softening as tears welled in their eyes. One of them whispered, "I've seen animals grieve, but this feels like faith." Malcolm smiled through his tears. Faith is all this ever was. The dog's tail thumped once more against the dirt, the rhythm steady and sure, the same beat that echoed in Malcolm's chest. "You waited for me," he whispered, his hand still resting on Bishop's head. "You waited all this time." The air shimmered with the weight of unspoken words, of gratitude, of absolution. The bond between them had never been broken. It had merely stretched across years until the world could catch up. Bishop moved again, sitting upright beside the wheelchair, his body pressed close, a quiet vow renewed in touch and breath. Malcolm looked into those amber eyes that had seen the same sky from the other side of loss, and said quietly, "We survived for this." The wind moved through the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of rain. The field glowed with late afternoon light. For the first time in years, Malcolm didn't feel broken or old or confined by the chair. He felt like that young man again, crouched by the ravine, choosing compassion over self-preservation. In front of him was living proof that love could travel farther than pain, that the world could bend itself backward just to let two hearts find their way home. Reuben stepped closer, placing a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "You ready to head back?" Malcolm shook his head, slowly smiling. "Not yet. Let me stay with him a while." The evening light stretched long and golden over the sanctuary, the kind of light that turns everything it touches into a memory before the day has even ended. Malcolm Trent sat quietly in his wheelchair, Bishop lying pressed against his side, King curled at his feet, and for the first time in 30 years, the world around him felt whole. The other Rangers had drifted away, leaving them in peace, and only the wind and the hum of distant insects filled the silence. Malcolm reached down, running his fingers through Bishop's fur, feeling the steady rhythm of life beneath his palm, and whispered, "You found me, and I almost didn't believe it could happen." Bishop's tail thumped once against the ground, slow and certain. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows grew softer around them. When Reuben returned later to check on him, he stopped at a distance, unwilling to disturb the sacred stillness between man and animal. What he saw made his throat tighten. The old ranger head bowed slightly, and the two dogs flanking him like sentinels carved from loyalty itself. The world seemed to pause there, caught in the fragile balance between ending and eternity. For Malcolm, the moment was not about recognition or wonder anymore. It was about closure. For years he had believed his sacrifice in the canyon had been an ending. But now he understood. It had been the beginning of something larger than pain, something that could outlast both of them. "I gave you my legs," he said softly, "and you gave me back my heart." The words floated into the air unclaimed, but the way Bishop leaned closer told him they had been heard. The next morning, a staff member who had witnessed the reunion uploaded the recorded footage online. Within days, it spread across the world. Millions of people watched in silence as a gray-haired black man in a wheelchair reached out to touch the face of a golden German shepherd. Their reunion a quiet miracle in a noisy world. Comments poured in from every corner of the globe, people calling it proof of the soul of grace of divine timing. but Malcolm never read them. He wasn't looking for fame. He didn't even know what viral meant. When Ruben told him the video had reached over 20 million views, he just chuckled and said, "Then maybe the world needed a reminder of what love looks like when it doesn't ask for anything back." Reporters called, news stations begged for interviews, but he politely declined them all. Some things he told Ruben aren't meant for microphones. He didn't want the noise of the world to drown out the quiet truth of what had happened. He just wanted to live out whatever time he had left with Bishop and King in the small rhythm of ordinary days filled with the kind of peace only earned through loss. The sanctuary built a special area for him, a modest cabin overlooking the fields so he could stay near the dogs who had become symbols of hope to millions. Malcolm spent his mornings watching the sunrise, the dogs sitting beside him, their heads lifted toward the wind. Visitors who passed by often stopped in silence, moved not by spectacle, but by the serenity of the scene, a man who had given everything, surrounded by the living proof that kindness echoes longer than pain. He began writing again in the old leather notebook he kept in his lap. His handwriting was shaky, but clear. He wrote about mercy, about the smallness of heroism, about how love has no language but presence. "The wild never took my legs," he wrote in one entry. "It traded them for the kind of peace that only comes when you give without expecting return." As autumn came, his health began to fade. The long days tired him faster, and his hands trembled when he wrote, but Bishop and King never left his side. The younger Rangers noticed how Bishop seemed to sense the changes before anyone else did, how he would nudge Malcolm's arm gently when he struggled to breathe, how he would lie closer when pain crept into his bones. The bond between them deepened, wordless but strong. A conversation continued in heartbeat and breath. One evening, when the air turned cool and the first stars began to pierce the sky, Malcolm sat outside watching the horizon. Ruben joined him quietly, sitting beside the chair. "You know, Ruben said that video might outlive both of us." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Good. Maybe it'll remind someone that kindness is never wasted." He looked at the dogs lying beside him and added, "We save each other in ways we don't even see until the end." A week later, Malcolm didn't wake up. The Rangers found him peacefully seated in his chair, the notebook still open on his lap, his hand resting against Bishop's back. On the last page, written in his neat but trembling script, were the words, "If he comes looking for me, tell him I didn't leave. I just went ahead." The sanctuary held a small memorial service attended by those who had known him, those who had worked beside him, and those who had watched his story unfold from afar. They buried him beneath a young acacia tree planted near the field, the roots wrapping slowly around the soil where he had once stood as a ranger. The plaque at his grave read, "He listened to the wild, and it listened back." For days after the service, Bishop refused to leave the spot. The sanctuary staff tried to coax him away with food, with gentle hands, with familiar voices, but the dog simply lay there, head resting against the earth, eyes half closed, guarding the man who had once saved his life. King came too, lying beside him, the two of them, silent in shared vigil. Rain fell one night, gentle and cleansing, soaking the ground and the dogs' coats, but they didn't move. Ruben came to check in the morning, finding them there, still loyalty turned into prayer. "He'd have liked that," Ruben said softly, his voice breaking. "He'd have said you were keeping watch like old friends do." The staff eventually fenced the area off to give the dogs space, but they continued to visit daily. Visitors came from all over, leaving flowers, letters, and tokens by the memorial stone. One morning, weeks later, the staff found only one dog lying there. King had returned to the cabin. The end. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes kindness never dies. Tell us what you think about this ending. Did the bond between Malcolm and his dog move you? And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too.